Hey there, friends. Pastor Cliff Wall. Hope you're having a wonderful Wednesday. You know, there's a story in Matthew 14. It's in other Gospels as well. But the story is that Jesus walks out onto the water of the Sea of Galilee in the midst of a violent storm, as a matter of fact. And his disciples had been out on this boat all night long. And here comes Jesus walking on the water. Well, sometimes people may not catch the full meaning of this passage. It was a real event, it really happened. And Jesus, through this event, was revealing something about his identity, about who he really is. And this is something that he had already done before and had done in many different ways. But this was another way that Jesus was revealing to his disciples and to us through our understanding of the story who he really is. So the Bible actually ends, Revelation chapter 21, verse 1. Toward the end of the Bible, there, we see this statement. It says, in terms of the new heaven and the new earth, it says, Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. That's a curious phrase. It's not saying that there's no longer in the new heavens and the new earth going to be any bodies of water, or any seas, or any oceans, literally, physically. But what it does mean is that there's not going to be any more forces of chaos to wreak havoc and destruction in the new heavens and the new earth. There's going to be no more sighing, no more sorrow, because there will be no more sin, no more evil, and no more chaos in the world. And so, what the story of Jesus walking on the water is getting at is about Jesus's power and who he is in terms of having power over these forces of chaos. Biblically, the sea is symbolic of the forces of chaos in the world. And it's evil and sin that opens the door to the forces of chaos coming back into the lives of people. We see this, of course, in the stories in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 and following. And when we see the story of Genesis, we see that God brings order by separating the waters. There's a separation and creating boundaries and space between the waters that brings life and order into the world, and the order that makes it possible for life to flourish. But what we also see as we continue in the story is that evil opens the door for the forces of chaos to come back in physically, but there's also a connection to the spiritual and moral condition of humanity that can be related. It's not entirely related to all of the forces of nature, but that there is a relationship that we need to be attentive to. And so the sea and the waters there, and we see this throughout the scriptures, represent the forces of chaos. And it shows us in these stories how evil and the seduction to evil can open a door, sometimes unsuspectingly, to these forces of chaos coming back into the world. Now, we see this most vividly and most clearly in the story of Noah and the flood. What we see there is a reversal of creation. We see anti creation when the waters no longer are within the bounds that God had set them. Now, the symbolism here is incredibly important, but it shouldn't be used to dismiss that this pointing to something very, very real and something that does involve the physical. And so, to understand the story really of Jesus walking on the water, it's a revelation, an epiphany, a theophany, if you will, about who Jesus really is. When he comes walking on the water, he had already before that in Matthew chapter 8, we see this story where he was asleep on the boat in the middle of a storm, and his disciples were in fear for their lives. And he was peacefully sleeping, and they wake him up and say, Hey, don't you care that we're about ready to perish? And he stands up and he chastises them for their little faith, and then he just commands the winds and the waves to be still. and the storm stops. And they are left with this question: who is this who even commands the winds and the waves? Well, we know from the stories in Genesis and also the story of Exodus, and then other stories later in the Bible, like the story of Jonah, that it is God Almighty, the creator of the heavens and the earth, who has this power over the forces of nature and over the forces of chaos and over the sea. And so, as Jesus comes out walking on the water in Matthew 14, at first his disciples, they think they see a ghost, and Jesus says to them in the Greek, ego eimi, which is literally I am. It can technically be translated as it is me or it is I, but in this context, I think it's quite clear that the intended translation should be Jesus saying, do not be afraid, I am. Job 9:8 and Psalm 77. There's other verses in the Psalms where it tells us that it is God who has the power to tread upon the seas, who can walk through the seas, who has the power over these forces of chaos represented by the sea. And so by walking out on the water, Jesus is demonstrating that he is the one who does have the power over these forces of chaos and destruction. And so this is another example where the Old Testament symbolism and the imagery we find helps us to understand the New Testament. And most importantly, it helps us to understand the identity of who Jesus really is. Sometimes there will be folks that will balk at the idea that Jesus was God in human form, that he was fully God and fully human, and that he was entirely divine. And they will say, well, the Bible never explicitly says that Jesus was God. Well, it does actually in some places. That it clearly does say that Jesus was God. Thomas exclaims in John chapter 20, when he puts his hands and after the resurrection, he realizes that Jesus truly has been raised from the dead. He exclaims, my Lord and my God. And I believe that he meant that in the fullest sense of both of those terms. And so, but in this case, it's an example of where the symbolism provides the framework for understanding who Jesus really is. And he is on the side of the creator, the one who commands the winds and the waves. In the story of the Exodus, it's God who controls the winds and the waves to make a way for his people to cross through the Red Sea. In the story of Jonah later, we'll see that it's God who is commanding the winds and the waves in the story of Jonah. And here, this is a revelation of Jesus' full identity and who he really is. And he's the one who has ultimate power over the forces of chaos. Now, in the story in Matthew, Peter sees him, and there's still a question here about who is this? Is this really Jesus? And then there's a question still lingering in Peter's mind and in the disciples' minds, and really doubts lingering in their minds as doubts linger in ours too. And the question is, well, it's Jesus, but is Jesus really this person that he is seemingly to be? Is he seemingly claiming to be this fullness of God in the person of this man? And as a matter of fact, Peter says, well, if it's really you, Lord, then bid me to come out on the water. And he also, Jesus says, come. And Peter begins to walk on the water as he focuses his mind on Jesus. But as soon as he takes his eyes off of Jesus and begins to look around and is alarmed and distressed by the winds and the waves, he begins to sink. Well, as he begins to sink, Peter cries out, Lord, save me. And Jesus reaches down and lifts him up out of the water. Well, what Peter is actually doing there is he is echoing something that we read about in Psalm 69. In Psalm 69, at the beginning here, it says this: verse 1. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me. And so Peter is crying out to be saved by God. Save me, Lord. And Jesus saves him. This is a theophany. This is a revelation of who Jesus really is. And he has ultimately the power over all the forces of chaos and death and destruction that come with them. And so later in the story of Jesus, we're going to see, of course, remember that he is going to allow himself to be completely overcome, seemingly, by these forces of chaos and death and destruction when he gives his life and allows his life to be taken on Calvary's cross. He seems to be there completely swallowed up by the forces of chaos and the evil and destruction of this world. And yet, 3 days later, he rises triumphantly when all hope had seemed to be lost. And if you will, the hope seemed to be lost at sea. He arose from the dead, revealing in an even greater way that he truly is the one who has power over the forces of chaos and destruction in the world. And he is the one who brings about this new creation, the new heavens and the earth. And he makes it possible where there will be a new heaven and a new earth, where all things have been made new, and where there will be no more sea. And so this is the hope that we have in Jesus Christ, that when all hope seems to be lost in this world, we know that it's not lost at sea, because we have a place in a kingdom, in a new heaven and a new earth, where there will be no more sea. Take comfort in that today, my friends, and may that peace keep and guard your heart now and forever in the hope of Jesus Christ, the Lord of all. God bless you.